Namaste to everyone, and it's my pleasure to invite all of you on behalf of International Institute of Vedic Sciences, the Shivatika, for this special talk. Uh, I am E.S. Srinivas. I work as a professor at IIM Bangalore, and this is really my privilege and pleasure to have present to you Professor Subhash Kak, the speaker of the day. Subhash ji, namaste. And oh, am I audible? Yeah. So just to introduce Professor Subhash Kak for the speaker of the day. In fact, I was pleasantly kind of noticed that the institute is called Institute of Vedic Sciences, and the topic is what is Vedic science. So I said you can't have a better topic, more appropriate, and for the topic you cannot have a better speaker, more eminent and more appropriate than Professor Subhash Kak. So it's our pleasure and privilege to have him. And then I was going through his background, PhD from IIT, worked in IIT Delhi initially, and for long years he's in the US, and working as a Regents professor at University of Oklahoma, Stillwaters. And these are just, computer science is his kind of background, but I think if you see his publications and scholarly work, the canvas is amazing to say the least. I have seen people who had either canvas or depth, but it's a rare combination of both canvas and depth. So I really kind of looking forward to listen to him, because the subjects that are covered, I just mentioning to him before this talk, like how one person can master so many diverse kind. It's impossible to have this kind of canvas. So it's great. If I think my father would have been really happy to see, he was always wanting to have a scientific view of the ancient Indian knowledge systems, and he kind of really represents that kind of background. So being a computer scientist, he's doing research on artificial intelligence, cyber security, host of things. On the other side, he's a philosophy of science, philosophy of mind. I think you see the number of books, more than about close to 20 books, a large number of papers, and and I was kind of conviction and courage. These two things I can stand out in terms of his pursuit and contribution. A lot of people personally may believe in certain things, but to do a scholarly work and stand against the vast majority of the Western probably kind of biased or educated in a different way, in a scholarly field, talking and presenting ideas is really, to say the least, is very inspiring. So I kind of was able to look at some of his videos and papers, and I kind of thought this is like his contribution from Panini to translations to, like, it's not like kind of one or two topics that is covering huge lot. So this is great, and when such eminence becomes generous, this beautiful movement comes. So this is a beautiful moment for all of us at International Institute of Vedic Sciences. So Professor Subhash Kak, I present to you. Professor, I think you have about a little more than 1 hour for us interaction, and post that, if we will, depending upon the time and questions, we will respond to those things. Once again, thanking you and welcoming you for the session.
Namaskar. Thank you very much, Srinivas ji, and thank you to the International Institute of Vedic Sciences to give me this opportunity to speak to you of not just my own work on what the sciences in the Vedas are and how they've been fundamental, not only to the development of the ordinary sciences that we know, both in India and abroad, but also hold the key to the resolution of some of the most central issues confronting science at this point in time, which this latter part would probably come to you as a surprise, but I hope to show to you and convince you that indeed that is the case. Now, to first of all begin with a short or brief look at the time horizon that we are looking at. We have much astronomical pointers in the Vedic texts, and they tell us, for example, there is memory of events that took place in 4th millennium BC, which is at least 6,000 years ago. And there are other astronomical events which point to the 3rd and the 2nd millennium BC, and then 1st millennium BC. In other words, there are whole series of various astronomical events, and the logic of that is that the Earth has precession, and because of that precession is a top which rotates, and its top points to different directions. That's how the Earth rotates, and the pointing to different directions, which are different stars in the sky, also changes the seasons. Every nakshatra moves 1,000 years, or the rashis move every 2,000 years approximately, and therefore the listing of the nakshatras changes depending upon where in the literature we are, and therefore we do have a general idea of what the chronological time horizon is. Now, the second interesting point to note is that there are different layers of Vedic literature. As we know, we have the 4 Vedas, the Samhitas, and then we have the Brahmana texts, then we have the Aranyakas, then we have the Upanishads, then we have the Sutras. So this is in a whole sequence. And then you have the Upavedas and the Vedangas. Then you have the Darshanas. You have the various Shastras, which cover a whole variety of sciences. And this is and then of course, out of these, you also have Jyotish, for example, in the Vedanga, which is very important because that, as I just mentioned, has a bearing on our understanding of chronology. So a whole sequence of texts which is unparalleled in any culture or civilization. So a huge amount, and only a fraction of that has been translated and cataloged. There's a lot of stuff that is still lying in temples and at people's homes, etc., which still needs to be examined. Not the earliest, but the later parts of it. Now, Mundaka Upanishad says that knowledge is of 2 kinds, apara and para. Apara is knowledge which can be expressed in terms of language, which you can speak about. So apara knowledge is knowledge about things, either physical things or abstractions, because you can speak of abstract things and you can speak about their relationships. And so most of the knowledge that one obtains in school or college or the university is apara. Now, the Vedas do include apara, but the pinnacle of all knowledge is paravidya, which is the knowledge of the experiencing self, which is the subject, which is us, our innermost being. So the Vedas ultimately are paravidya or atmavidya, and that is something at which door modern science is only now approaching. All of Western science until now, and to that Western science also, Vedic sciences have contributed quite a bit, and I hope to show that. But it's only now that modern science, either from the perspective of neuroscience, psychology, or computer science or physics, is asking, who is the observer? who is the person who's doing the experimentation, which is which or what is the awareness, or what is the physics of the awareness behind the subject. And that is precisely what Atma Vidya is, or which in modern terminology is now called the emerging science of consciousness. Therefore, the future of science as we know it is also in the Vedas, which is an amazing thing. And there are some questions here, and I will maybe I will address them now, and then I'll go back to some of the older sciences. One question that comes up is how, if the whole world as we know it is governed by laws, which in Sanskrit is called rit, from rit or ritam, right? From where the English word right, which is something regular, R-I-T-E, also comes. If everything is according to laws, then how do we have freedom? Where does swatantra come in from? Or how do we have freedom to operate? And so this is a important question to which Western science has no answer. In Western science, ultimately, the more you analyze, you're forced to acknowledge or admit that we are machines, and the idea of freedom is a mirage. In fact, there have been some books in recent years where what's been claimed is that there is nothing like consciousness. We do everything by instincts, like animals do, or like machines do. And all our actions can eventually be traced to either random events or certain behaviors which are hardwired into our brain. But not so in Vedic science. In fact, this is a question which goes back several centuries or thousands of years. And in Vedanta, one of the ideas is called Drishti Srishti Vada. The question was asked, how does the deity, how does Paramatma create? And the answer that is provided is that and Paramatma doesn't have to interfere in rhythm. The processes go on, but by the very process of drishti, by looking, the world changes. And my late friend, who passed away last year, the great modern physicist, George Sudarshan from Kerala, in the 1970s, wrote a very famous paper called, a paper dealing with what is called the quantum Zener effect, where he showed that in a physical system, in a quantum system, just by observation, without expending any energy, you can steer the state of a system to whatsoever state you want, or you can actually freeze it. You can stop the evolution of a system, which is an example of consciousness controlling physical reality. And the quantum Zener effect has been seen in the labs, and this is one of those very, very important new researches which provides a bridge between the mind and the physical universe. By mind here we mean consciousness, because mind itself is an inner instrument. Mind in Vedic thought is also physical, but it is illuminated, so to speak, by awareness, by consciousness. So here is one pathway, so to speak, which tells you in what sense would or might Vedic science have a fundamental influence on the development of new ways of confronting problems of personhood and problems of freedom. But now let me backtrack. And this is something, of course, we can come back to later on if there are any questions. But let me backtrack and provide a kind of a personal take on how I got to be working on all of this. And this will hopefully address the question that Srinivasji had in the beginning, that how did I come to work on or make my contributions in the study of Vedic sciences. So it so happened that in the mid 80s, I was working on AI. And then I remembered that my father, when I was young, used to tell me that here is this amazing grammar written about 2,500 years ago, grammar of Sanskrit called Ashtadhyayi by Panini, which described the entire language in 4,000 algebraic rules. And this is amazing because no grammar of any living language has been so expressed. And in fact, the greatest scholars have called Panini one of the greatest geniuses of all time, because his achievement has not been paralleled. And in fact, the way he described Sanskrit grammar in 4,000 algebraic rules, some of which are rules about rules, is exactly like a program, like a computer program. Because in a computer program, you have rules, and then you have your language also expresses rules about rules. So this was very interesting, and so I wanted to investigate this further. And then what struck me was, when I was analyzing scholarly work on this subject, that books stated that when Panini created his amazing grammar, there was no writing in India. And then I read other histories on India, which said, well, all of Indian math and geometry and astronomy came to India after the Greeks. And what Indians had was principally, their Vedas and their ritual and their religion, and maybe they had some philosophy, but really all the sciences came from abroad. And in fact, during 19th century, Westerners tried to make the argument that since India didn't have sciences, that's why India needed guidance by the British. The British needed to rule India because India didn't have a history of science, and we live in the age of science, so we need our hands to be held, so to speak, and we need to be told which way or which direction we should go and how we should do science. Now, this is, of course, quite contrary to the very magnitude of what Panini had done. If Panini has not been equal for 2,500 years, clearly no genius appears, a great rishi appears in a vacuum. There must have been a whole series of antecedent sciences. I was trying to be logical. So what I did was I said, well, let me investigate all of Sanskrit literature layer by layer and see what I find. So, of course, you have the sutras, then you go backwards, and you have the Upanishads, and then you have the Brahmanas and so on, and the Vedic text itself. And the question which intrigued me was this thing about the claim that all of Indian Jyotish came to India after the interaction with the Greeks. And in fact, serious scholars in the 70s, these are Western scholars, were making the case that if you find anything in Indian Jyotish which is not to be found in Babylonia or in Greek, it is in Indian Jyotish, it's not elsewhere, it should be taken as Western or Greek Jyotish, which was forgotten in Greece and has been remembered here. In fact, 4 days ago, I came across a clip by one of India's leading leftist historians, where amazingly she claimed that Yudhishthira, when he expressed an attitude, a desire to go to the forest, the story of it in the Mahabharata must have been derived from Ashoka's desire to give up his rule and go to the forest. Even though Ashoka is 230 BC and Yudhishthira is at least, according to tradition, the Kali Yuga is at least 3000 BC. But even if you were to say that the story was written after the event, we do know that Panini himself, in one of his sutras, suggests that he knew both the Bharata, the original 24,000 verse Mahabharata, which was expanded to 100,000. So 4th century BC, the time of Panini, both the Bharata and Mahabharata was known. So to assume that the contents of Mahabharata somehow derived from an individual who lived 230 BC is fantastic, to say the least. But this is the kind of logic that's been used by Western historians to make the case that all of Indian sciences are to be seen to have come somehow after the interaction of the Greeks. This is sort of totally crazy. And the sad thing is that our books have yet not been revised, even though no scholar would accept it now. But a lot needs to be done in curriculum and in presenting this case to the youth, because it has obviously a big impact on some people who take this for the real truth. And therefore, I'm very pleased that International Institute of Vedic Sciences is going to address this issue and many other related ones. But now let me go back. So this is one. So what I did to begin with was to look at the Indus Script, because the claim was that there was no writing in India, and Brahmi, which is the script used during the time of the Mauryas, out of which all Indian scripts are derived, including Tamil and Telugu and Kannada and Malayalam and Bengali and Siddham, which is still used in Japan, and Devanagari, and the scripts of Indonesia and Thailand and Philippines and Hangul of Korea, which was, of course, invented only 1,000 years ago. So all of these are derived from Brahmi, and Brahmi goes back in India to about 3000 BC. So it's at least 5,000 years old. And did I say Brahmi? I mean, the Indus script goes back to 3000 BC, and Brahmi is about 300 BC, but now records have been found in Sri Lanka, which go to at least 500 BC. And then there are some findings of inscriptions which go back to maybe 700-800 BC. And the Indus script also, the latest records are probably in the 2nd millennium BC. So there is closeness appearing in the period of the Indus script, which incidentally in a paper that I wrote for the Indian Journal of History of Science argued should be really called the Saraswati script, because most of the sites of the so-called Indus civilization, which is also now called the Sindhu-Saraswati civilization, were on the banks of Saraswati River. So I was able to show in papers that I wrote in the 1980s and 1990s that on probabilistic and structural grounds, Brahmi is most logically derived from the Indus script. So there is this continuity. There is also Vedanga Jyotish, the Jyotish, which has an internal date of 1350 BCE. And certainly that is much earlier than Babylonian astronomy of 600 BC. So you have that, and Vedanga Jyotish has intricate information on computation of tithis and this and that, the motions of the sun and the moon. Now, the very fact that now we could date Vedanga Jyotish with certitude has a lot of bearing on the old colonial narratives on Vedic history. Now, while I was doing this, I was studying the Shatapatha Brahmana, and I discovered in the Shatapatha Brahmana, the great Agni Chayana rite of the Vedic times is described. In the Agni Chayana rite, there's this big falcon-shaped altar in 5 layers that is constructed, and of a total of 1,000 bricks of different shapes. And the falcon, or Shena in Sanskrit, represents time. And these altars were supposed to be constructed in a sequence of 95 years. And there were different rules about how to construct the first layer, the second layer, the third layer, etc., etc. And while I was doing this, ultimately I discovered that there was a logic to it, the number of bricks, and it had connection with Jyotish itself. And what I discovered was that the Vedic rishis, first of all, were aware that the sun and the moon are both 108 times their respective diameter from the earth, right? Which is why the diameter of the sun or the moon is about the same, which is about half a degree. And which is why eclipses take place, because the angular size of one and the other are the same. And one of the central ideas of Vedic science is this relationship between Brahmanda and Pinda, the entire cosmos and the body. So if you have the outer cosmos, which in the Gayatri mantra, for example, is described as Bhu Bhuva Swaha, which means the earth, the atmosphere, and the sun. Likewise, you have a correspondence within the body of the Annamaya Kosha, which is the body, the Pranamaya Kosha, which is the atmosphere, which are the various currents within the body, including the various breaths, the 5 breaths, and then Manomaya Kosha, which Manas is actually illuminated by the Atman within. So, because the sun and the moon are 108 times their diameter away from the earth, and in fact, modern science has also shown that the diameter of the sun is 108 times the diameter of the earth. Now, the rishis either intuited it, or they could do a very simple experiment. You take a big pole and you move it. You ask your disciple to move it 108 times the height of the pole away from you. Its size would be the same as that of the sun or the moon. So that's how you prove that the sun and the moon is 108 times their diameter away from the earth. So the rishis then said, well, how do we convince people that indeed there is this sambandham or bandhu, sambandham between the outer and the inner? And this is one of the central ideas of Vedic science, this bandhu between the outer and the inner, between the body and the cosmos. And in order to teach it, they said, look, you must, in your own sadhana, in your own practice, make a journey, a symbolic journey, a pratikatmak journey from earth to the sun, from your body to the inner sun. The inner sun is, you might want to call him Vishnu or Shiva or the goddess, the Devi. And that's why there are 108 names of the god. You're making a symbolic journey. Each name is one step, because the sun and the moon, as I've said, is 108 times their respective diameter from the earth. And that's why you have 108 Tirthasthanas. That's why you have 108 Karanas in Bharatanatyam. You have 107 Marmas, because the body itself is an image of the cosmos. Because if you have 108 things which you stack one on top of another, then the number of meeting points will be 107, which is why you have 107 marmas in the body. What else did we have? Yes. Now, if you have, if the sun and the moon are 108 steps away, that means from sunrise to sunset or moonrise to moonset, you will have 108 times pi, right? Pi r. 108 is the radius. 108 times pi, which is 339. In other words, on equinox, which is 21st of March or 21st of September, from sunrise to sunset, equinox is when the night is the same length as the day. From sunrise to sunset, you'll have 339 disks of the sun. And likewise, on a equal night, you'll have 339 disks of the moon. While I was meditating on this, one day in 1993, I had a flash and I realized that this was also the secret of the very organization of the Rig Veda and all the Vedic texts. And I rushed to the library and I opened up my Rig Veda and I looked at the whole number of the suktams in the Rig Veda, and there are 1017. Since the Veda is supposed to be Traividya, and I've already mentioned to you why, 1017 by 3, there are 1017 suktas plus 11 extra ones, but 1017 is the basic, divided by 3 is 339. And I've already told you where this 339 comes in from. And the Agni Chain ritual already celebrated this number 339. There were 3 kinds of altars, the Vedis. One was Garhapatya, which represents the earth. Then you had 6 altars representing the atmosphere. These are the Dhyashna altars. And then you had the Mahavedi. Around the Mahavedi, 261 pebbles were placed. Around the atmosphere altars, 78 pebbles were placed, and 21 pebbles were placed around the Garhapatya or Grihapati's altar. Remember, the atmosphere plus Mahavedi altars exactly is 261 plus 78, which is 339. So these numbers are coded. These numbers are coded in the structure, not just of the Rig Veda, but also the other Vedas, all the Vedas together. It's incredible. It's absolutely astonishing that there was this Jyotish which had been created or placed as some kind of a rahasyam for us to discover, for us to marvel at this amazing sambandhams and this connection between the outer and the inner, which the very structure of the Rig Veda and the other Vedas embodies. And not only does it do that, it also tells us that the Vedic rishis were careful observers. So just to buy the case that some biased, half-baked scholar from the outside is saying that, look, whatever you have, you sort of backdated it. It's all conspiracy. So whatever you have is actually from outside, either from Greece or from Babylonia. Totally ridiculous. Because here we have all this information which goes counter to that. Now, what little the Indian students, because we are still, our education is still colonized. We've been free for 70 years, but our education system uses textbooks, probably because our textbook writers and educational institute managers suffer from alasyam. You're lazy, you inherited books, you just modified a little bit here or there. You've got to rewrite them to express them in a fashion which does justice to the Vedic knowledge system. Now, we do know from the wonderful book that Dharampal wrote 50, 60 years ago. Dharampal was this scholar. What he did was, he says, well, the English established some colleges after 1850s, and now we are educated because of Macaulay. We are educated in subjects the way the English saw them, which is not to say that we must reject them. We must take the best of both the West. We don't reject the West. We must take the best of the West, but we must not leave out the amazing knowledge system of our own. Now, what Dharampal showed was that before the coming of the English, the temples within India had these schools or pathshalas which imparted education to all jatis, to all communities. All this stuff that only one or two communities in India were educated was totally wrong. And perhaps literacy, and in fact, there are statistics, and these are statistics compiled by British superintendents of education. When they came to India, they studied how young people were being educated in temple schools. And then, of course, because of the conscious decision that the British took, was that Indians should be separated from their own educational tradition. So they shut that down, and the literacy rate, which according to the Dharampal, based on statistics which the English had compiled, was probably 60 to 70% at that time in the late 1700s or 1800. And by the time the British left, it had dropped to, I don't know, 4 or 5%. So what the British did was to introduce policies which have led to alienation of us Bharatiyas from our own tradition, from our own glorious tradition. It's also forgotten that, and comparative economists would vet this data. In fact, this is from Western comparative economists. They say that India's share of world economic output or world GDP around 1800, when the British took control of India, was 20 to 25%. By 1914, which is the worst point in this whole sequence, India's share of world economy had dropped to 1.4%, from 20 odd percent to 1.4%. So during the British rule, not only did we have many famines, we became, all our crafts, textiles, all of the stuff was destroyed by the policies of the British. And that's when the jatis sort of, when you're starving, you are more likely to hurt each other rather than when you're prosperous. So a lot of the bad stuff, and we must acknowledge the bad stuff, related to interjati relations emerged during those 10 or 12 centuries, 12 decades of British rule. And even now, when things are sort of better, we still have not reached 4%. And America is the wealthiest nation ever imagined, and America's share of world economy at this point is about 20%. So just imagine how rich India was, which is the reason why everybody wanted to come to India. Columbus set out to discover India because Europe was poor. Europe wanted to trade with India to partake of India's riches. So there are lots of factors that India seems to have forgotten, and we project our present to the past, and we imagine that our temples were like this, that all that they did was ritual. No, temples were great centers of all kinds of learning. Dr. Nagaswamy of Tamil Nadu, this great scholar, um, has looked at these inscriptions on various temple walls in Tamil Nadu, which speak about how temple organization had the hands of all jatis. I never use the word caste, because the word caste, there is no word corresponding to this made up word, this Portuguese word casta in any Indian language. What is reality is jati, and these jatis have been going up and down, but every jati should be proud of its background. Every jati is equal. According to Vedic sciences, every human being is equal in potential and in the capacity to do whatever is possible, because it's the same Purusha which is within each one of us. It's the same consciousness which is within each human being. And what happens is that due to various factors related to education, culture, one's experience, that or sanskaras, that we have what are called clouding of the mind. Mind is an instrument, it's an antahakaran, clouding of the mind, and you have vikshepa, which is turbulence, and then you also have avaran. So what yoga does and what the other shastras do, they provide us different ways of clearing the mind, the nirodha, chitta vritti nirodha, for example, of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, which provide the capacity to each human being to discover that infinite potential within us. Because as Vedanta tells us, that this physical universe is contained in consciousness. You know, it's us and the rest. We experience the rest of the world in our mind, and mind is, of course, only an instrument, in our consciousness. So what is fundamental to reality is consciousness, and that is the same for everybody. I also want to tell you that the scientific revolution, which is seen to emerge with Newton and Leibniz, the central idea in the scientific revolution was the mathematics of infinite series. But 300 years prior to the European work on infinite series was this Kerala School of Mathematics, with great names like Nilakantha and Madhava, who had already discovered infinite series. Mathematical machine theory or mathematical logic of the 19th century is prefigured in a Navya Nyaya school of Bihar and Bengal, which is at least 1,000 years old, which, according to Mary Boole, whose husband George Boole was one of the three creators of mathematical logic, that these three were students of George Everest, who had spent his life in India. He was the Surveyor General of India, and it's after him that Mount Everest is named. According to Mary Boole, these three learned their ideas of logic from George Everest. So even there, India has a role. India has played a role in the development of modern science. And then the deepest scientific theory there is quantum mechanics. The creator of quantum mechanics, Erwin Schrödinger, he was a Vedantin, and he used to carry the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita with him wherever he went. And in his autobiography, Schrödinger, he was an Austrian. Schrödinger claims that, look, the central idea of quantum mechanics, which is the idea of superposition, came to him from the Upanishadic Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma, that this Atman is the entire cosmos. In other words, in the single state is the superposition of all possibilities. That was the general idea that he got, which led to quantum mechanics. And from quantum mechanics came the explanations of chemistry. Without chemistry, you can't understand biology. Without biology, you can't understand DNA or the structure of the brain. So quantum mechanics really lies at the very basis of all of these sciences. So Vedic sciences have not only led to the development of Western science in so many different ways, they have within them also the potential to transform the science of the future, because we have now reached some kind of a dead end. In physics, for example, in physics, physicists are being forced to postulate dark matter and dark energy, which is 95% of the universe, even though there is no evidence for it. And it's quite possible that this impasse has emerged because there is need to introduce into physics the subject, namely the observer, in a much more direct way, and we don't know how to do it. And the whole Vedic tradition, where a lot of what is esoteric is a description of the subject. For example, you have the very architecture of the mind, as described in the 5 boundaries that are sketched in Sri Vidya. Sri Vidya represents not only the entire cosmos, but also the inner cosmos. So the very architecture of the mind is something which might have something to reveal to us in relation to how the subject and the object interact. Now, what quantum Zeno effect does is only the first step in it. And quantum Zeno effect, as I've told you, is just a first level formulation of the idea of drishti, srishti, vada. I must also tell you that the 6 darshanas, out of which Vaisheshika is the description of reality as atoms and their interrelationships. Vaisheshika of Kannada, which goes back to 500 BC. Vaisheshika is one way of looking at reality. On the other side, you have Nyaya, which is Tarka Shastra, which is reality as understood by relationship of atoms of speech, right? Because that's how logic works on atoms of speech. So you have Nyaya and Vaisheshika, which are complementary. You have Sankhya, which is the science of tattvas, various categories which constitute the mind and also the cosmos. And on the other side, you have yoga. And then we stand on Mimamsa, where we analyze our sanskaras and our ritual and our rites. And on the top is Vedanta. So these are all complementary sciences. It's beautiful, complementary sciences. And each one, Narada explains to Yudhishthira in Bhagavad Puran, leads to paradox or leads to paroksha, which helps one transcend and get into a deeper understanding. Now, I just wanted to, because we do want to have some Q&A as well, I just wanted to tell you that Kannada in his Vaisheshika Sutras, first of all says that all of outer reality can be described in terms of padartha, their gunas, and their kriya, which means substances, their properties, and their motions. But as far as we are concerned, we relate to these properties through Samanya, which is universal, Vishesha, which is particular, based on how our perception interact with this outer reality. And then the meeting of the two is called samavaya, which is precisely like that collapse that takes place in quantum mechanics itself when the object is observed by the subject. So there are lots of interesting threads here. I recommend to you that if you go to medium.com, I have some essays where you will not only see a popular level description of all of this, but you'll also see the references which will take you to the original scholarly articles that will show you that um, that the point at which sciences stand right now, the Vedas have within them the capacity to help solve these problems. So this has been a wonderful adventure for me, and I hope that it'll be a wonderful adventure for all of you as well, because there is nothing as extraordinary and as beautiful as the whole system of Vedic sciences. I could speak on it, of course, endlessly, not only the Vedas, very briefly that I've sketched them, but also the Upavedas, the arts, music, and linguistics, and all the other disciplines which have in stages also been at the basis of the corresponding Western sciences. For example, Panini's Ashtadhyayi was used by de Saussure to come up with structures which have led to the disciplines of anthropology and sociology. At this point, I stop. Thank you, Srinivasji.
No, no, thank you very much. It was like amazing, and I think introduction to the whole gamut of things you have been exploring. And I think I have a couple of personal questions. There are some questions from the audience, but I think you mentioned a couple of points, maybe whichever you can pick up one of them to respond. And you, at the beginning, you talked about freedom, role of freedom vis-a-vis predeterminism or something which is kind of structured, a destiny kind of thing. So is there a categorical statement by the Indian thought on that? Is it because we keep seeing this said by in different ways, whether it's Bhagavad Gita or saints, or we were talking about even Ramakrishna Paramsa saying everything is predetermined and we are kind of things. So what's the stand, and what if it is a paradox, and how do you understand this paradox?
Well, if you look at Shankaracharya, for example, he speaks of Shivoham, I am Shiva. Or you look at Kashmir Shaivism, right? I am Shiva. That each person, consciousness is Shiva. And Shiva, Vishnu are the same. You know, these are different names that we use. So each person is divine. This is what Veda says. And why we feel we are limited is because we are separated through these avarans, through these coverings, from this infinite light which resides within us, right? So the moment we have access to this light, that's when creativity occurs. That's when we are articulating divinity. That's when we become like devas. It's when we think we are just the body, that's when we are asuras. The asuras are the materialistic or material aspects of us. The asuras and devas have to be together. The devas are the cognitive capacities within us. The asuras are the material capacities. We need both, which is the reason why, in order to get vibhuti, in order to get special siddhis, there has got to be this churning, this manthan, samudra manthan, not only at the cosmic level, but also at the individual level, you know? And
Yeah.
it's when that manthan occurs that you get all these powers, right? Siddhis. But Kena Upanishad also tells you that he who thinks he knows not. Because if you think you are doing it, you are really being driven by your vasanas and your sanskars. You are really not free if you think you're doing it. If you let go, that's when you're free. You know, the idea of swatantrata is an extremely sukshma one. Swatantrata is like being in mid current of this river, and that river represents uh, the unfolding of divinity, unfolding of the universe, where we are one with the gods. So when you are mid current, when that avaran has been removed, then you are free, because then you can say shivoham shivoham. You see that? It's when you are in the on the on the bank, on the on in your body, and you think you are Ravana. I am the most powerful, right? That's when you are limited, because you are in that eddy. Then you are in those vrittis. The vrittis are the eddies related to our physical system getting transformed or getting pushed by the infinite force of our consciousness, of divinity within us. So there is freedom, but this freedom is paradoxical, because when we are free, then we are really godlike. When we are free, then like Srinivas Ramanujan, we are getting all these creative impulses, the formulas, as Ramanujan could not explain where he had gotten these formulas, but he would tell G.H. Hardy or whosoever asked him, he says, well, the goddess Namakkal or Namagiri comes to him in his dream and tells him the formula. And the moment he wakes up, he writes it down and he can't explain it. And even now, 100 years after his death, because for 50 years, his notebooks were lost. For the last 50 years, mathematicians, some of the smartest mathematicians have been working on his notebooks, which he wrote when he was dying. And they have found that almost all of what is in the notebooks is correct, and they can't explain where he got that mathematics from. In fact, that's how all creativity occurs. All the Vedas are a way for everybody to discover that source of creativity, of that srijan within each human being. And if we had access to that, and we have access to it, but we are not looking, we are not turning our gaze. In fact, there is a school in Kashmir, it's called Pratyabhidya. And what that means is recognition, that divinity or sadhana is ultimately recognition of one's true self. And how to do that recognition is what sadhana is all about. So the Vedas are not just abstractions of what reality is. You know, you can talk endlessly. They are actually the technology, a way to obtain that insight and intuition. And that is what liberation is all about. Because Punarjanma occurs not just at the end of one's life, but it occurs many, many times in this life itself, when one has become free of the sanskars. The sanskars are wonderful for one to understand the reality, but they also imprison us. So ultimately, when we get out of those sanskars, when we are truly free and liberated, that's when you obtain that deep understanding.
Wonderful. I think it looks like some scars are like lenses which helps you to see the reality in a particular way. And when you are devoid of lens, and I think that's a state only people who have experienced can comment. And but at least theoretically, it looks like you are not limited, you are not narrow any longer. You probably have a complete picture rather than having a one perspective. So,
You do need sanskars. Education for the young must include sanskars because that's how you train your mind, antahakaran. You train your mind to look at reality. But once your education is complete, then you need to transcend the sanskars, not to turn your back on it, but to learn how to transcend so that you can open that lens up. But you have to, in the beginning, to learn how to operate that lens. And so education must constitute sanskars, the sanskar meaning the right way of looking at things. But ultimately, you have to transcend para. From apara, which is based on such sanskars, you have to go to para, where you are beyond all of them.
wonderful, sir. There are two couple of questions. One person says, does Professor Kak has a group or a center that is doing and disseminating this kind of research? So maybe they should visit your website and.
I don't have a website, but if you go to Twitter, I have a link which gives you maybe 100 or 200 papers on the Vedic sciences published in scholarly journals,
Yeah, yeah,
peer-reviewed journals. They're not just made up because you can say anything. And many of them have links, live links, so you can read these articles for yourself. I have 20 books. Most of them are also for 69 rupees in the Kindle edition. Or if you don't have, or if you just send me an email, I'll be happy to send you a PDF copy. I put them there. Everything is
yeah,
free, and some of these texts are available on the
yeah,
internet for free. I
yeah.
don't have a formal school or group, but I can tell you that I've been giving these Zoom interviews literally every day. So there must be a lot of stuff out there on the internet.
Yeah, I know. I have seen that a lot of that. One kind of when you talk about sadhana, and you said it's technology, not just philosophy, Vedic science, Vedic literature. In sadhana also, they talk about multiple methods or multiple approaches, or it's like Patanjali is the one of the important technology sources.
No, no, of course, there's so many different kinds of sadhana, so many different kinds, depending upon your temperament, the personality that you have, what you like to do. Your sadhana could be nrityam. You might be a dancer, or it could be music, or it could be your academic discipline, or you could even be a businessman. You could be sthit pragya in such a way that you are living life, and people think that you're like everybody else. But through each action, you are doing your sadhana. So every action is equal to every other action, in terms of its capacity to take you to that deep understanding. So many different ways. And you may have found that connection with a guru that you find inspirational. And so that is perfectly fine. But for each of these sadhanas, the most important thing is yamas and niyamas,
Yeah.
ethical and moral principles. Without ethical and moral principles, without swadhyaya, for example, without tapas, without purity, you cannot proceed. So that is fundamental, because if you don't have proper niyams and yamas, then you will get stuck. At some point, you think, well, now I'm so powerful, because you would have gotten some siddhis. Then you'll become asuric, right? But if you want to go all the way, you truly have to be, you have to have your niyams, you have to have purity, you have to have swadhyay, you have to have ishwar pranidhan, you have to have, humility, because if you have arrogance, then clearly that would be an obstacle.
Yeah, these tales of derailment are both in Puranas and everyday life, you see them, kind of thing. from my side, one more question, and then you started with Mundaka Upanishad, and I vaguely remember it talks about a shloka where there are two birds sitting on the kind of branch of a tree. One is the experiencing self, and second is the witnessing self. So when you say mind, mind is the experiencing one or the witnessing one?
Say,
They say they are inseparable. So
in Kathopanishad, actually, in Kathopanishad,
okay.
You have the body like a ratha, or in the Bhagavad Gita, right? You have the mind is holding the reins, buddhi is the reins, the senses are the horses, and then you have Krishna, right? The Sarathi, Partha Sarathi, right? Krishna is the witnessing self. This is Sakshi. So Sakshi is consciousness. Mind imagines that it is awareness, but it's not. The Vedas tell you that the self is the seer behind the seeing. The seeing is the instrument. Eyes are an instrument. You can also hook up an integrated circuit, a computer, which can do the same processing. But the computer cannot do the seeing. The hearing device cannot do the hearing. So the self is the actual experiencer, but the mind imagines it's the experience. And if it's not a realized self, the mind doesn't know its true self, then it thinks it's very powerful. Then it becomes like a Rakshasa. Then it thinks that, hey, it's me. But that's, of course, moha, right? That's delusion. And that's what leads to conflict, and that's what leads to tragedy, and that's what, for example, is leading to all the problems in the West. Because in the West, what education system teaches you is that you're nothing but the body, and so the West has thought it was very powerful, and now you see all the problems. And that's the problem of Lanka, for example, because what's going on in the West is what the Ramayana, what Valmiki already foresaw in the story of Ramayana. Here is a society devoted only to the body. What the Veda says, no, no, you can't, you don't go away from the body. No, as Ishavasya Upanishad says, Andham tamaha pravishanti ye avidyam upasate. Tato bhuyo ipto tamo ye vidyayam rata. Into blind darkness for those who worship avidya, or body, or materiality, who think that mind is everything. But into greater darkness for those who think it's only uh, vidya, because vidya needs avidya. Consciousness needs materiality. So it's the samanvaya of the two. It's a beautiful, beautiful, most extraordinary thing, that you can be a rishi living in society. Well, some people could be sannyasis because they've done through this all. That's fantastic. That's beautiful. But it is the Vedas for everybody. They are for everybody. From brahmacharya to grahastha to vanaprastha and to sannyas. They are for everybody. They are universal. They include everybody. It's the challenge not only for Bharat right now, but for the entire world. Everybody, the rest of the world is waiting for the Vedas. And it's up to us to rise up and be the Vishwa Guru that Bharat truly is.
Wow, that's a great statement to close. I have, just out of curiosity, the last one from my side. Scholars like you providing you overwhelming evidence and logic and sources to show that kind of which actually should enhance our collective self-esteem of the as a kind of concept of belonging to a nation. There is more opposition from the Indians. Like many of the Westerners are curious or open-minded. I'm just trying to understand, because you wrote books on mind, what is that your own kind of culture positivities? You don't have to be glorifying mindlessly, but if scientific evidence is overwhelming, what prevents them to have at least an open mind and willing to have a relook rather than feeling emotionally upset that these things are happening? That typical historians and scientists of Indian origin and working in India. So it's a huge opposition. Why what? I can understand this mind-wise.
What has happened is that the West uh, enslaved India intellectually. But before independence, they were great people, like Raman, like J.C. Bose, S.N. Bose, Tagore, all these great sages, Ramana Maharshi, and so many others. Um, um, and all across the country. But somehow after independence, India adopted an educational system which has denigrated and demeaned or ignored India's own tradition. Now, we are not saying that it should be glorified. No, no, no. Don't demean it and just leave it there for whatever there is and let people
Right.
discover it for themselves, right? There
That's
is
so.
a Now, since we teach all this wrong stuff, the problem is what they're teaching about it is wrong. For example, the NCERT book on physics, which I just happened to look at the other day, the ninth grade book has a chapter on atoms, and what it mentions about Canada is totally wrong. So there is sort of alasyam because Canada says there are four kinds of atoms. Two have mass and two don't. And it doesn't say that at all. The book doesn't say that. There is a saying in the West, if you do the same thing over and over again and expect something different, that is insanity. So Indian education system is poisoning the minds of the kids over and over again every generation. And then expecting these kids when they grow up to love India, how is that going to happen? It's our fault. It's
Yeah.
our fault. But fortunately now, because of social media and because information is available literally freely, for example, my books are available freely. My books are all in various journals. So those books and Western, Indian, both. So information is available freely. Let every human being check it out for themselves. If it doesn't make sense, reject it.
Yeah.
But if it makes sense, if the greatest scholars and artists and scientists in the West and in India say that this is what has changed us, this is the most beautiful thing, then at least let's try to see what it is. And this is not to say that we should reject the West. No, West has its own beautiful aspects, its literature. We also embrace the West.
Yeah.
But let's create, because this is for the entire humanity. It's not, the Vedas are for all entire humanity. But let's do our bit, and but let's use our viveka, let's use our discrimination, and uh, reject those things in our society which didn't make sense, which appeared to make some people uh, have less capacity than others. No, the Veda says every human being is equal. Every human being has the same capacity. All that they need to do is to go within and open the curtains, so to speak, to turn their gaze and look at themselves, and they'll see that they're Shiva. Each one of them is Shiva.
Wow. That's a great closure. And I think it's very reassuring and encouraging. We are leaving with an optimistic note and inspirational note. You are now on the advisory board to the Prime Minister of India on science, technology, and innovation. And we also feel not just honoring a person when you are awarded Padma Shri last year, 2019, it's the work that you represent, the thought process you represent. It's honoring our own kind of thought process. We all Indians who kind of should feel proud. And when people like you, who kind of had the courage to take the controversy in the scholarly kind of domain, are identified in the cutting edge fields like computer science, institutions like MIT recognizes you as one of the top scientists there. This is kind of very, very reassuring and inspiring. It was great listening to you, Professor, and look forward to be in touch and derive more guidance and inspiration from you. Wonderful. And a few more questions we'll post you by email. So if you feel like you can send, we can give them back. We've already taken a lot of your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Srinivasji, and I'll be more than happy to answer questions by email. So feel free to write to me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.